and organ builders. And, it's where two of my spheres of life cross, because I know there are going to be quite a few organists watching on Zoom tonight, including my old mentor, Nigel Holdsworth, gifted organist, and it's one of those people you keep bumping into in town. But of course, as YAYAS, it's very much one of the things we were involved with in the early days. When a new church was refurbished or opened, the next thing that happened to that church, as well as staffed, was getting an organ. And the organs in so many of our churches are now part of the architecture. And it's only when they're removed, as they were at St. Michael of Belfry, that we notice the space they leave behind. And of course, the organ at St. Michael of Belfry is now very nicely ensconced in St. Lawrence's. And some of us went on a visit to see that, you will recall, a few months ago. So it'll take some questions at the end. So I'll leave you warmly welcoming Dr. Max Elliott. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone, and I hope you can hear me on Zoom as well. I have to say, it's wonderful to be with you and to see so many organ fanatics. I didn't realise we had so many in York. My PhD, as John has already said, can we get past it? Yeah, it's not on this screen. Yeah.
Can we have the light on a second?
Need to see the keyboard. Thanks. Bear with us on Zoom. We'll just find out to get rid of the got it symbol on the screen that's been projected in the Friends Meeting House. There it is. In that left-hand box.
No? There's always something, isn't there?
Yeah. Can you maximise that one? On it again, see if you can maximise it in the top right one. Can you right click see if it's maximise? No,
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Should treat in the back, but she doesn't seem to be done with the local fair yet.
There we are.
Really, never.
Thank you. I'll try again. My PhD thesis was on the organ building industry in 19th century York. Today I've been asked to speak about the organ builders of York in general. I will cover the medieval builders, the 18th and the 20th century builders, but very briefly. As you can expect, I could stand here for 5 hours talking to you, and nobody wants that, especially me. When I finished my PhD, I printed it in two forms. I did a softback version and a hardback version. And of course, a PhD is a bit of a dead document once you've finished it. And I was very concerned about that. And I want to make sure that the research I did can continually be updated. And so I made a website. This is yorkorganhistory.co.uk. And on there, you'll see the main builders, organ builders of York: Robert Postle, William Denman and Son, Thomas Hopkins and Son. And if you click on those, a drop-down menu will give you links to every surviving organ that's in an original or near original condition, with photographs and specifications. And I thought that as I carry on doing research after the PhD, or other people, in fact, if you go and see one of these organs and happen to take some really good photographs, do send them in and I'll keep things up to date. So, medieval organ building in York. Medieval York contained over 40 ecclesiastical buildings, as I'm sure you know, including York Minster, several monastic establishments, and numerous parish churches. The city was so extravagantly endowed with places of worship that only London, Norwich, Winchester, and Lincoln could compete numerically. The importance of York as a provincial centre was recognised in 1396 when it was elevated to county status, and its churches flourished under a buoyant economy. Perhaps unsurprisingly, therefore, at least 22 craftsmen are known to have worked as musical instrument makers in medieval York, and several local churches appear to have contained pipe organs, including All Saints Pavement, St John's Ouse Bridge, St Martin's Coney Street, St Michael of Belfry, and St Michael's Spurrier Gate. Owing to some, quote, hard pruning, the number of churches in York decreased significantly at the Reformation, and after a consolidation of benefices in 1586, York was left with just 23 parish churches within or adjacent to its historic walls. Now, you're all the experts on fabric. Does anybody know where that carving on the left is in the minster? Hands up. Hey, I've caught you out. It's actually on the screen as you're walking through the pulpitum. It's just on the arch above your head. So right underneath the current organ is a portative organ, and there's an organ at St Dennis. Jumping ahead a little, the organ building industry in York declined significantly during the mid-17th century for obvious reasons. There was religious upheaval, with numerous clergymen being ejected on doctrinal grounds, and congregations finding that the forms of religion established in York between 1644 and 1660, and directed by the four Minster ministers, were more congenial than any which they had enjoyed since the Reformation, or were to enjoy again after the Restoration. It has even been claimed that the citizens of York leaned to the Puritan camp in religious observance at least, a fact that perhaps explains why John Hinkston, a former member of the choir at York Minster, was given the dubious honour of being organist to Oliver Cromwell in 1654. In the aftermath of the English Civil War, pipe organs were removed from several York churches, including St Dennis on Walmgate. Fortunately, organ building in the city of York recommenced almost immediately after the restoration of Charles II in 1660. On the 26th of August 1662, an organ builder called Edward Preston agreed to undertake, I quote, the constant amending and keeping of the organ from time to time, this is York Minster, in tune, for an annual fee of 40 shillings. Although somewhat vague, the contract with Preston usefully confirms the existence of both an organ in York Minster and a local organ builder during the immediate years after 1660. It is not known whether Preston had somehow managed to remain in the city throughout the Commonwealth, or simply returned to England around the same time as his colleague, Robert Dallon, who is a name familiar to organ building fanatics like me. Sir John Hawkins wrote in 1776 that accepting Dallon's, Loosemore of Exeter, Tamar of Peterborough, and Preston of York, there were at the time of the Restoration scarce an organ maker that could be called a workman in the kingdom. So York was quite unusual. You know, you've only got York, Exeter, Peterborough, and the Dallon family, who were incredibly famous at the time of the Restoration. Jumping ahead again, sorry, Andy, if I feel like I'm not doing these people a lot of service, but we've got a lot to get through. York occupied a preeminent position, as you know, at the beginning of the 18th century, as the most prestigious social centre in the north of England. The citizens of Georgian York took a full, indeed a leading part, in the spirit of the times. 6 organ builders established themselves in York during the 18th century, or at the very beginning of the 19th century. We have Mark Anthony Dallon, who is part of the Dallon family, Ambrose Brownless, Edward Riley, Thomas Haxby, John Donaldson, and Robert Boston. Thomas Haxby and John Donaldson were very significant figures. The latter has even been regarded as an important landmark in Yorkshire's organ building history. Unfortunately, we don't have time to cover their careers in detail, but I'll just show you these 2 rather handsome instruments. The one on the left is Haxby's organ at Newby Hall, and the one on the right is Donaldson's organ at the Holywell Music Room in Oxford, both of which are playable and very lovely examples of their time. Haxby is known to have secured around 10 organ building contracts, so not that many, during his 40-year career, whilst Donaldson built or rebuilt at least 40 organs during his 29-year tenure in York. He was in Newcastle before coming here. And after the death of Donaldson in 1807, his foreman, Robert Proston, described as a very ingenious artist, took over as York's only organ builder. This is where it gets interesting. So the organ building industry in York lost its last 18th century member with the death of Robert Boston on the 25th of March, 1814. A generation of craftsmen led by John Ward, you can see he's got a really long bar. These bars show you how long they were active as organ builders. So he was active for a very long time. John Ward introduced fundamental changes associated with the so-called insular movement in organ building. I'm not going to do too many technical terms, but that is one of them. Between 1814 and 1865. Andreas Eberhard Ullmann, I think that's how you pronounce it, John Parkin, John Brown, John Hunton, and Bartholomew Pexton all established themselves as organ builders in York during the 41-year career of John Ward, but none of them successfully challenged his hegemony over the city. The organ building industry in 19th century York was transformed after 1835 by Robert Poston. Again, you can see his one is quite prominent, and grew considerably during his 47-year career. After adopting aspects of the so-called German system, again, another technical term, I'm afraid, Postel emerged from the shadow of John Ward to become the foremost organ builder in York. Richard William Chapman, Henry Whitehead, Joseph Bell, Forster and Andrews, a York branch, of course they were a Hull firm for those of you who know their work, Pilcher Jones, T. Hopkins and Son, W. Denman and Son, and Charles Christian Duffel, all established organ building businesses in York between 1835 and 1882, but none of them were as prolific as Postel. After dissolving his partnership with Josiah Wordsworth on Tuesday, the 22nd of May, 1888, Samuel Maskell, the chap at the bottom, established himself as an independent organ builder in York. A new generation of craftsmen, led by John Dorrell Denman, so that's William Denman's son, and Walter Hopkins, the son of Thomas Hopkins, took over the organ building industry during the 1880s and 1890s. T. Hopkins and Son continued to trade until 1921, and its demise marks the end of a fascinating period in the organ building history of York. As you can see, a total of 16 organ building businesses, constructing over 460 organs between them, are known to have operated in York during the 19th century. Instruments manufactured by the 19th century organ builders of York have survived in numerous locations across the United Kingdom and abroad. But we didn't all know that about York. So, I'm going to look at some of the builders. I'm not going to look at all of them, you'll be pleased to hear, but some of the important ones. This is John Ward. John Ward was, without doubt, the most important organ builder in early 19th century York. Born and raised in Lincolnshire, Ward moved to York in 1814 and established an organ building business on College Street before relocating during the early 1820s to number 25 Micklegate. And I think I've got a photograph of what I believe to be, though do correct me if I'm wrong, number 25 Micklegate. I think it's the portion on the right-hand side, and it looks about the right age for him to have been there. During his 41-year career, Ward built or rebuilt over 80 organs and is said to have, quote, held sway in Yorkshire. Sadly, John Ward is only now remembered, if at all, for his major rebuild of the Minster organ between 1821 and 1823. When the arsonist Jonathan Martin set fire to the choir of York Minster in 1829, he famously stated that its organ, as rebuilt by John Ward, made such a noise of buzz, buzz, that he said to himself, I'll have thee down tonight, thou shalt buzz no more. And that is where my title of my PhD came. Fortunately, few contemporaries appear to have shared his opinion. One writer stated in an account published by the Yorkshire Gazette on Saturday, the 5th of January, 1822, that when Mr. Ward concludes his designs, we may challenge comparison with any organ in the empire. The specification that Ward produced for York Minster was certainly a remarkable conception for the date, and its 7-stop pedal division that you play with your feet was unprecedented in England because of its size and scale. The bottom F of the sack-foot 24-foot rank measured 14 inches in diameter. Ward was regularly heralded by local newspapers as one of the most talented and skillful citizens in York. We don't have time to discuss Ward's organ-building career in much detail, but I ought to briefly highlight some of his most important achievements. For the Yorkshire Grand Musical Festivals of 1823, that's this one, 1825 and 1828, Ward constructed what we call detached consoles with complex mechanisms that enabled organists to play the Yorkminster organ whilst sitting in an orchestra pit located over 100 feet away from the pipes themselves. This really was quite unusual. It had been done at the Handel commemoration in Westminster Abbey in 1784, I think, off the top of my head, but it was only 20 feet away. So if you can imagine, the organist is sitting with the orchestra down there, and then there are long connecting wooden tracker rods that you literally press down and it will operate the pipes 100 feet away. Quite an achievement. He was an early pioneer in terms of adding pedal pipes to organs, and particularly well known for producing what he called harmonica stops. It's not a harmonica as we would think, but types of pipes known as harmonicas. Now, this is the interesting bit. What do we know about him on a personal level? Turns out quite a lot. Ward's life was coloured, sadly, by the tragic death of two close family members. Ward's only daughter, Jane Spanton, died in 1830 at the age of 28, shortly after the birth of her daughter, Susan Jane Spanton, who then died just 2 years later. She was only 2. Ward maintained an active interest in painting and art. He is said to have personally restored some of the paintings at the Merchant Adventurers Hall during the governorship of William Pape and amassed a good collection of pictures. But, I quote, by injudicious purchases without knowledge, it brought him into trouble, causing him to lose much of the money he had made. If you'll permit me, I'd just like to share with you 2 amusing anecdotes about John Ward. In 1822, Ward took his neighbour on Micklegate, Peter Armistead, to court, because Armistead, a butcher by trade, had, quote, thought proper to educate a number of pigs for the table, which he fed with offal of slaughtered animals in such a manner as to greatly annoy the neighbours. After appearing before magistrates in July 1822, Peter Armistead agreed to remove his piggery in order to avoid facing trial. The counsel for John Ward claimed that over the next few months, however, Armistead threatened to renew the nuisance, and that he had published a caricature depicting one of his pigs playing an organ. At a hearing in January 1823, the counsel for Peter Armistead argued that they really could not see why this prosecution had been instituted, except that the caricature of the pig and the organ had given offence and had caused Mr. Ward to become jealous of the abilities of Mr. Armistead's pigs, which he was afraid would be playing the organ better than the large one was played, which Mr. Ward had recently erected in the cathedral. These are not the actual sketches. That's actually Handel. This is a very famous depiction by Joseph Duke. But it's very similar, actually. It's pig playing the organ. The other amusing story, and then we must move on from Ward, about John Ward that I discovered during my doctoral research involves a set of pedal pipes, the largest of which was 24 feet long, a rarity in early 19th century England, that he produced for the organ at York Minster. After seeing one placed on a handcart at his works in Micklegate, John Ward is said to have walked alongside it with all the importance of a successful man. He was a little, dapper man and rather pompous in manner. On reaching the minster before morning service, he saw it laid carefully down in the aisle of the south transept, where it caused much curiosity. As Canon Harcourt, brother of the Archbishop, passed across the transept to robe for service, Mr. Ward called his attention to the pipe and said it was quite large enough for a man to crawl comfortably along it inside. And to demonstrate this, he popped down on his knees and crawled in, at which the canon turned on his heel and went to the vestry. 2 of those chorister boys, who had been witnesses to this little scene, now saw the opportunity for a good joke so turned the guard stay that had crossed the pipe end and gave it a screw up, leaving the little man inside and they running off the service. When Mr. Ward tried to back out, he found himself a prisoner, and as service had commenced, he could not shout or make a noise, therefore had to remain a considerable time cramped but fuming with rage at the trick played upon him. And it was not until a verger heard a peculiar noise coming from the pipe that his release was secured. I think that's a wonderful story. This is a pipe from the Wanamaker organ in Philadelphia, the largest organ in the world with 6 keyboards. And when that was first done, they managed to fit a Shetland pony inside one of their pedal pipes. John Ward died on the 12th of January, 1855, and was buried at York Cemetery 4 days later. The next chap, Andreas Eberhard Orman, or Oman, not quite sure how we pronounce that. Little is known about this guy, having apparently been employed by, or perhaps formerly apprenticed to, John Ward. Local trade directories confirm that Orman began to work independently from number 24 Gillygate during the 1820s. The organ that Orman built for St Mary's Tickhill near Doncaster in 1831, that you can see here, is said to have been rich in tone and particularly suited in size and power to the church, than which none other can be found better calculated for music. I agree with that. The universal satisfaction that was shown speaks sufficiently in recommendation of the builder. Although Orman is not known to have built or rebuilt any other organs, he is said to have been also a maker of violins of very good tone. The local antiquarian and stained glass artist, who I'm sure you're all familiar with, John Ward Knowles, recalled that he had seen one of these violins with a Orman label inside at Noyes in Clifford Street, but I haven't found any surviving examples. The next builder is John Parkin. He was born at Austerfield near Bawtry in 1808. Having purchased a workshop on Marygate in York at some point during 1832, Parkin commenced work with the assistance of John Boston from Manchester, late of the firm of Wren and Boston, a very well-known name. His experience as a tuner and builder is well known. The extent to which Boston influenced Parkin is not known, and his position as foreman was quickly taken over by a trainee called Robert Postle at some point during 1832. The careers of Parkin and Postle were initially intertwined, but posterity has bequeathed 2 very contrasting legacies to these craftsmen. Owing to his untimely death in 1834 at the age of 26, Parkin has largely been overlooked by scholars. The 47-year career of Robert Postle, on the other hand, is integral to the organ building history of York, and you will hear more about him later. Although Parkin and Postle only worked together briefly, their short-lived collaboration is important because it finally ended the monopoly that John Ward had enjoyed in York since 1814. Here you can see 2 proposed case designs for the organ that Parkin built for Christchurch, Scarborough in 1834. I don't know which one was accepted, and it doesn't exist anymore, I'm afraid. John Brown built or rebuilt only 14 instruments during his time in York, but his role within its organ building industry was significant because he substantially increased local competition. Although Orman and Parkin were technically responsible for overturning the monopoly that Ward had hitherto enjoyed, Brown was the first craftsman to challenge his hegemony successfully. The one manual organ with 5 speaking stops, that's different ranks of pipes, Brown constructed for St Mary's Church in Sprotborough, that's in South Yorkshire near Doncaster, during 1839, is said to have contained pedals, but it is not known whether this included independent pedal pipes or just a pedal board that pulled down the normal ranks of pipes. Despite being rebuilt and enlarged on several occasions, the organ at St Mary's still retains some pipe work by Brown and its case complete with the original name. Nice. John Brown constructed a substantial organ for the new Centenary Wesleyan Methodist Chapel, now known as Central Methodist, on St Saviour Gate in York between 1840 and 1841. With 3 keyboards and 23 speaking stops, the Centenary instrument was much larger than any previous organs built by Brown. With the completion of such a substantial and lucrative contract, Brown may have hoped to receive many new orders, but it would appear that his business did not expand as expected during the 1840s. Sadly, he moved to Doncaster in 1842 and never really managed to capitalize upon this instrument. The case is the one from his 1841 instrument, although the pipework inside has been much altered over the years. It's fabulous case, mahogany. Now we come to Robert Postle. So we've had a few little builders between John Ward and Robert Postle, but Robert really is an important figure. He was the most prolific organ builder in 19th century York. Between 1835 and 1882, Postle built or rebuilt over 160 organs across Great Britain, and 2 were even exported to Pietermaritzburg in South Africa, or Natal as it was. Most of the organ building commissions that Postle received were for churches in Yorkshire and County Durham, but his sphere of influence appears to have extended far beyond the region. Over the course of his 47-year career, Robert Postle was variously lauded as an excellent and judicious, celebrated and well-known organ builder. Local newspapers repeatedly lavished praise upon him, even claiming on one occasion that Postle's workmanship was worthy of the great fame he has now enjoyed for many years as an organ builder of much eminence. At least 6 other organ builders are known to have received training under Robert Postle, and his impact upon the next generation of craftsmen was significant. For some of the later organ builders that I'm going to mention, I said that you can go and see the surviving organs on my website that I produced, but there are quite a few for Denman and there are quite a few for Hopkins. There aren't that many for Postle, so I thought I would actually just take you through some of them. This is what they call a barrel organ at Holy Trinity Blacktop. Can you see the barrel with the little pins in it? If you didn't have an organist who could play with their hands, you would buy a barrel organ and then literally stand there turning a handle and it would play a selection of 12 hymns. I have got a recording of me doing it, but we don't have the facilities to play things, unfortunately. I took Nigel Holdsworth and Stephanie with me, who are watching tonight, and we played hymns on on the Gareth then. I went into the vestry, we found it, early 1950s, private. And moved here in the 19th century, late and opens those and changes the volume that you will hear. So it's really clever. You can have a crescendo and a diminuendo. Oh, we've got this thing again. You remember what we did last time?
Oops, and all together. Whoops.
Actually, it might be all right. You're standing.
Can't read that.
Get help on that.
No. Let's just X out of that.
Yeah, that's what we've got. Click on that one.
We click on.
Go on there.
That's
Click on
it.
that one. It should pop in. Now we've got HP support system open.
Might add, well, we've got this little pause that
We-
we are going to have to buy a new laptop because this HP one is now so slow. We need one with a solid state hard drive. So we are in the process of getting
That's
another
it.
one to stop things like this.
And then we want to do that.
Yeah. Is that all right?
Yep. Yep. We're back.
Yep.
I hope you enjoyed the interval. Robert Postle's organ at Arbroath This organ was restored in 2001 by Sandy Edmonston and is in good condition. A friend of mine, Chris Bragg, one of these fantastic organ enthusiasts like myself, has just organised an organ week at St Andrews. He lectures at the university there, and it's going to include a visit to the postal organ at our grove. And I'm going to go up and talk to them about postal. And it'll be quite an interesting thing. I still haven't heard this organ, although I've seen a letter commending it, written by Dr Francis Jackson, the late Francis Jackson, organist of York Minster. And about a year ago, I phoned Francis and said, "Do you remember going to see this organ?" He said, "Oh, I thought I'd never been to Marlborough." So obviously not. But it is a rather lovely thing, and a close-up of that nameplate. Isn't that fantastic? So then, County Durham, St James de Letts, Forest in Teesdale. This instrument is just a one manual, just one keyboard. It's a lot smaller, but it fits the building perfectly. You couldn't ask for anything better. It hasn't been played for 70 years. When I went a couple of months ago, I convinced my partner, unfortunately, the blowing handle, because it's all hand blown still, the leather straps connecting it to the reservoir have perished, but I convinced my partner to lift up the tabletop, the reservoir top, to get enough air in, and we managed to get a few notes out of it. And I don't think the people there had realized that you could even do that. I'm hoping at some point soon we will get this all restored. It's an incredibly important historic instrument, but you can see the condition. Not irredeemable though. We have some very talented organ builders in this country who could restore this piece. You see, he's changed his style of nameplate. This is the one that you see most often, that floral version only for a few years. This is at Tuxford, quite a well-known instrument. Paul Hale, the local organ advisor for Southall, keeps a good watchful eye on this one. We can see the top of my head. Folketon, closer to home, little one manual, Scarborough. And this is his most famous. He had his workshop renamed Blenheim Place after Blenheim Palace. Blenheim Palace is unusual. It's like every good house. It's got pipe organs in it, but it actually has two. It has a fantastic, enormous Willis organ in the long gallery, and then in the chapel, it has this postal organ. I've not yet found out how Robert Postel of York secured the contract from the Duke of Marlborough. One day I would like to do that, but it is a lovely instrument. It's in good condition. Like Folketon and some of the other ones, it was restored by Peter Wood and son of Harriet not so long ago. This is one outside Hartlepool, and then Weldrake closer to home. Finally, there are two more. These are the ones that are in original or near original condition that I don't know the date of. This is at Sutton-on-Derwent. It is a very early example. I think it must be the 1840s, 1850s perhaps, but I don't know an exact date. I think it's been moved from elsewhere. And then this one has been slightly altered, but most of the pipework is still original. Now, before we move on, one thing I ought to talk about, I mentioned briefly one technical term, the German system. And we had an organist here in York called John Camage, organist of York Minster for many years. And he was responsible with John Ward for rebuilding the organ to that unprecedented scheme that I mentioned. People have often guessed that he got the idea for having a large pedal division on the organ from a trip to the continent. And recently we found out that yes, he did go to the continent. He went to the continent in 1847, so after the Ward rebuild. But he went in 1847 because his son Thomas Simpson Cabbage started having lessons with Felix Mendelssohn at Leipzig. And you might be wondering why I'm saying this. This sketch, as you can see, is of Helens and the minister, somewhere artistic licensee around Betty's. Who knows who sketched that? Anybody? Felix Mendelssohn. Felix Mendelssohn sketched that sketch on a visit to York when he was on his way up to the Hebrides. Anyway, that's a slight peek. Robert Postel died in 1882 and is again buried at York Cemetery, but as you can see, his grave doesn't reveal very much. Now, I'm going to mention three minor characters, but they're quite interesting, so bear with me. John Hunton is known to have built or rebuilt 10 organs across Yorkshire, Lancashire, and County Durham during his time in York. Many of the instruments constructed by Hunton were praised with typical mid-19th century phrases such as fullness and richness of tone, extraordinary power and sweetness, power, brilliancy of tone and sweetness, see what they're going at, and very powerful and splendidly toned. Although these somewhat generic descriptions were applied to many new organs, it would appear that Hunton perhaps deserved at least some of the adulation. Sadly, Hunton appears to have struggled financially throughout his career and been forced to supplement his income by exploiting various abilities, including cabinet making, coffin making, and you can guess where it's going next, undertaking. This wasn't unusual. We had another organ builder in York who didn't work independently. I think he was only ever an employee, but his name was Thomas Henry Meek, and in order to supplement his income, he made umbrellas. Bartholomew Pexton briefly worked as an organ builder with John Hunton in the late 1830s. The two of them founded a business together and built an organ for Albion Street Chapel, which is sadly not here anymore. But for the rest of his career, he concentrated on making what we call free reed instruments, things like harmoniums, terrapins, tremones. Richard William Chapman claimed that he had spent 8 years with the famous John Ward, but he doesn't appear to have built any pipe organs himself. Most of his 20-year career seems to have been spent manufacturing pipes for others. Henry Whitehead conducted business as an independent organ builder in York from around 1847 until 1861, when he moved to Ireland. 7 of the 17 organs that Henry Whitehead constructed from his premises in York are known to have been replaced, I'm afraid to say, within 28 years of their installation. And that is a big investment for a parish. The organ of All Saints in Saxton from 1851 was replaced by Forster and Andrews only 8 years after its construction. And the median average of all 7 examples is just 17 years. There he is, Henry Whitehead. He supplemented his income by acting as a concert agent for various musical ensembles. And you might be wondering why I put a fairground organ there. There is a reason. He is also known to have operated a circus at St. George's Field in York, employing an equestrian performer called James Powell, together with his family, 2 clowns, performing dogs, and trained horses. On Tuesday, the 14th of January, 1862, Henry Whitehead was ordered to pay £46 and 8 shillings in wages owed to the Powell family after a hearing of the Yorkshire County Court. I just think that's amazing, an organ builder and circus owner. Joseph Bell, he is an interesting chap. He only built about 7 organs, but he did build quite a few harmoniums. We will see one of the organs that he built here. This is the only one that survived in pretty much original condition. It's got 3 stops and 1 keyboard. It's a tiny little instrument that's skeleton based, in very poor condition, but could be restored without too much financial commitment. The pipes that you see on the front are dummies. They're actually only half moons. They're wooden, and they're just there for visual interest. This is another of his instruments. 1855, he rebuilt an older organ at All Saints Pavement. Many of you will be acquainted with the church. The organs have the church has had a long history of various organs. This one was in the East End, southeast end, but not in an organ chamber. The one that followed this was in an organ chamber. You can just about make out the text, oh God, and then something underneath. But if you look in William Camage's book, The Old Street of Pavement, on page 45, this is from 1893, he says, on the north side of the case, a ribbon runs along the top bearing the words, "We praise thee, O God," whilst in the centre are inscribed the letters IHS, and below is the word Amen. On the west front, there is in 2 different places the inscription Hallelujah and Praise the Lord. And he says the decorations are chaste and effective, without being gaudy, and accord well with the surroundings. I agree with it. It matches the pulpit very nicely. I went to see this. I'll let you read that poem by yourself. I won't read it out to you. Clearly, the way people advertise nowadays is quite different. because if you don't, I think it's a human. This instrument is in the store of the York Museum's Trust. It looks like a harmonium, domestic harmonium, but it reveals a secret, which I'll show you on the next slide. We'll manage to read that. His workshop was in Petersgate. But the crucial thing is, why is Petersgate like the northwest tower of the Minster? Because it contains a celebrated bell, referring to himself. So, this instrument is what we call a pipe harmonium. There aren't many of these about. On the left-hand side here, in the treble of the instrument, are actual organ pipes. They are stopped flute pipes that you would expect in any organ. Here, however, for the bass end, where you would need much larger, taller pipes, what he's done is he's taken harmonium reeds, which are basically just little flat brass things that you get in harmonium, and then put little resonators on the top to make the sound come closer towards a pipe. And at the bottom, instead of having just ordinary treadles and a harmonium setup, he's got a full organ reservoir here with organ weights at the top. So a really interesting instrument. It could do with being restored, but if you could play it if you wanted to give a concert. And I mentioned Foster and Andrews. I'm not going to say much about them. They were a full builder of very important stature. They had huge employee numbers and built instruments across the world. They did, for a brief period, have a branch in York, and I thought you might be interested in seeing some of the organs that they built in the city. I've not included Bishop's Cross, but the ones in the city centre-ish themselves. Some of these have survived. Thomas Malvern Street is still there in original condition, but most of the others have been altered. St Wilber's Roman Catholic and the York Oratory is in pretty much original condition. Then we get on to Pilcher Jones. He's an interesting chap. Pilcher Jones was blessed with highly promising credentials. Having been employed by the famous Victorian organ builder William Hill to work on the organ at York Minster during its 1859 rebuild, Jones was engaged the following year to remain permanently in the city as tuner of the Minster organ. As a former employee of Hill and well versed in the so-called German system, Jones might reasonably have expected to receive orders in quick succession. However, several unfavourable reports about his work appear to have prohibited him from successfully establishing himself in York, and he was consequently confined to the footnotes of organ building history. He was removed from being the tuner of the Minster organ towards the end of 1862 and replaced by another former employee of William Hill called Thomas Hopkins. You will hear more about later. Shortly after Thomas Hopkins received his appointment from the organist of the time, Dr. Edwin George Monk, what is called a willful disarrangement of the Minster organ occurred. After carefully examining the organ in York Minster, William Hill, the famous builder, and the local guy, Thomas Hopkins, declared, and I quote, "The persons engaged in carrying out this most wanton trick was," that's what they wrote, "perfectly conversant with organ building and with the structure of this particular instrument, and that the act must have been committed to gratify some malicious or revengeful feeling." Pilcher Jones was never officially linked to the offence at York Minster, and it would be unfair to cast aspersions, but his dismissal certainly could have been sufficient motivation for such an act. If you haven't seen this photograph before, it's wonderful. The organ was rebuilt, as I said, in 1859 by William Hill, and then Pilcher Jones and Hopkins looked after it. And this fantastic set of tubers, the loud stops, were added in 1859 and used to project straight down the nave. They're no longer there. Their successor, the tuba mirabilis, which was added by Sir Edward Bairstow at the early part of the 20th century, also points horizontally out, but doesn't stick out over the pole. I quite like the fact that they stick out. Looks like artillery. Denman. Now, some of you have been to see a Denman. You've been to see the organ at St. Lawrence. William Denman was one of the most important organ builders in late 19th century York. Over the course of his 34-year career, Denman built or rebuilt at least 88 organs. The distinctly Victorian style of organ building espoused by Denman has not always been fashionable, but his reputation has been somewhat rehabilitated in recent years. By working diligently and rising before it was light, the taciturn craftsman Denman proved to be a remarkable autodidact and became well respected during his lifetime. William Denman has been praised as an excellent workman and very clever mechanic by scholars. After retiring from daily organ building around 1896, Denman moved to Leeds, and his son John Dorrell Denman assumed responsibility for the family business. Most of the best instruments by the firm were from this latter period. John Dorrell Denman was a hugely influential member of the organ building industry in the late 19th century York. Having become active in his family business during the 1870s, John became caught up with Robert Hope Jones, perhaps not a name familiar to you, but quite a renegade in the organ building history, and introduced into this city a radical new style of organ building. The history of organ building in late 19th century York might have been very different if John Dorrell Denman had then not died at the age of 46, as I quote, he was about to establish himself on a larger basis. According to his obituary in the Yorkshire Gazette, John Dorrell Denman was greatly admired for his leadership of W. Denman and Son, and the best of the organs built by the firm were under his direction. Most of the surviving organs built or rebuilt by Denman and Son during the 1880s and 1890s are extremely well constructed and ought to be recognized as some of the finest instruments ever constructed in York. I did a talk for the York and District Organists Association back in January 2021 about Denman. It goes into quite a lot of detail, and there's a lot of, there are all the technicalities and specifications on there, because I aimed it towards the organist. But if you are interested in it, there's a lot more information about it in that talk. Some of the interesting things about Denman organs are that on the key sheets, these things on either side of the keys, you can see this scroll design. If you ever see that on an organ and there isn't a nameplate, it's a very good way of identifying who built it. It will be Denman. And he also used to have these card and collard, as they're called, rounded shafts. He wasn't the only builder to do that. Willis, Robert Postle, and Forster and Andrews used to do that as well. But it's certainly another indicator that the organ is by William Denman or his son. Here is the St. Lawrence instrument from St. Michael of Elfrey. And I think it is the best example of Denman's work. There are one or two other large instruments. There's one at Ormskirk, but it's in a very different style and it's been altered quite a lot. I hope that when you were there, they talked a little bit about the restoration. Nicholson and Co. of Worcester, Malvern, were responsible for lovingly restoring this organ. Every little detail and thought went into it. It was a real labour of love for them. And I think it just fits the building architecturally, musically, just the perfect fit. And it's great to see what was a slightly redundant instrument brought back to life. And if you go onto my talk from January 29, 2021, which is still on YouTube, you will hear some recordings of some of these Denman organs. Just show you his family tree. He was one of quite a few. And then this is his son, John Dorrell. I don't actually know exactly where William Denman is buried. I know it's grave 341 in section A of Hare's Cemetery. I took the photograph on the right-hand side, and I know that these graves are adjacent to his, but I couldn't find the one with a standing headstone for him, but it's roughly over. So the final major organ builder is Thomas Hopkins. Thomas Hopkins was born in 1826 and commenced work as an organ builder for William Hill, the guy we mentioned earlier, around the time of his marriage to Ellen Green on the 25th of April, 1859. According to one frustratingly vague source, Thomas migrated from London to Edinburgh and became organist of the Edinburgh University Music Hall Park Place at some point previous to the year 1862. It is highly likely, therefore, that Thomas worked on the new organ that Hill built for Edinburgh University Music Hall in 1861. Towards the end of 1862, as I mentioned earlier with Pilcher Jones, Edwin Monk, the organist of York Minster, invited Thomas Hopkins, presumably under the influence of Hill, to become official tuner of the organ in York Minster. Thomas purchased a workshop on Dewberry Terrace shortly thereafter and commenced building organs on his own account. Having remained on good terms with his former employer, Thomas was invited in 1863 to help William Hill erect the new nave organ that he had built for York Minster. I do have a photograph of that after his family tree. He had 12 children. Walter Hopkins took over the family firm. We'll discuss him in a minute. Arthur Hopkins was organist of All Saints Pavement. His daughter Elfrida was deputy organist at ARCO. That's an associate of the Royal College of Organists. Again, I'm not talking to organists. And the whole family seems to have been extremely gifted. That's the nave organ of York Minster. I assume some of you have seen it before. It still exists. It's in St Thomas Radcliffe on the outskirts of Manchester. And you can tell it was built for that space because it's an enormous sound. I mean, St Thomas is not a small church in Radcliffe, but this is an incredibly noble instrument. But I can see why there were opposite views about having it there, as it does somewhat disturb the vista of the nave. But it must have been a very, very good instrument. Thomas Hopkins was, as I said, invited in 1863 to help Hill erect this organ. This was a Hill organ that he had created for York Minster. Thomas then continued to collaborate with the Hill firm and received assistance from Messrs. Elliot and Wright by kind consent of Messrs. Hill and Son when rebuilding an 1862 organ by Telford and Telford of Dublin for the Yorkshire Fine Art and Industrial Exhibition in 1879. This was actually 9 years after the death of William Hill himself, but the firm continued. I'm sure lots of you are familiar with this building. This is the second building of the exhibition, not the Swiss chalet style one, but the back of the art gallery. Although his work was often deemed worthy of great praise by the local press, Thomas struggled to secure contracts as an independent organ builder, and only appears to have built or rebuilt 9 organs during his entire 31-year career. Thomas Hopkins is said to have been a man of modest and retiring disposition, but the commercial failure of his business must have affected him. And I have a wonderful quote here from John Ward Knowles that says, his health was not the best. Being troubled by asthma and probably coupled with depression, business for few orders reached his works. He fell into a peevish manner and particularly enjoyed indulging in a little pointed satire when in conversation with a friend. After a tiff with Dr. Monk, he often suffered from diarrhea. I don't know why it ends like that, but it does. Thomas Hopkins sought work as a singer, organist, and teacher throughout his career in order to provide additional income. At some point during part of Dr. Monk's time, Thomas sang alto in the choir of York Minster. He held posts as organist at St Saviour's, York, St Olive's, where I play, during the 1860s, before accepting the position of organist at Holy Trinity, Heworth, shortly after it became vacant in 1871. Although few accounts of his playing have survived, it is thought that he was particularly accomplished in the art of improvisation. The parishioners of Heworth certainly appear to have appreciated his abilities, as they presented him in 1886 with a substantial sum as a token of their appreciation for the manner in which he had for nearly 16 years conducted the musical portion of the services of the parish church. Thomas is known to have composed a small amount of music, but his efforts were rarely published. The Fellowship Hymn Book of 1908, edited by his granddaughter, Elfrida Hopkins, contains this hymn tune entitled Lux Beatissima. It's the second tune listed. And when I first discovered this, because obviously he's not very well known as a composer, his brother, Edward John Hopkins, organist of the Temple Church, was a very famous composer, but Thomas wasn't. I found this and I jumped for joy. I thought, oh, fantastic, former organist of St. Olive's, where I play, has written a hymn tune. And I sent it to my boss, I'm the assistant, I sent it to Keith Wright, the director of music. We both played through it. I said, I think we'd do the first tune. It's not the best. But this is him, as far as we're aware. Edward Hopkins, his great grandson, is 95% sure that that's him. His son Walter, who we'll see in a second, he's much more confident with, but he thinks that's Thomas. And then, in addition to this hymn tune, there's also a psalm. That's Heworth Church, it was when it was first built, And then that's the psalm chant. It's a double chant by Thomas Hopkins. I'm afraid to say again, it's not the best. So, Thomas frequently advertised his services as a teacher of organ, harmony, pianoforte, and singing. He also taught music at York Greycoat School for Girls on Monkgate during the 1870s and may have been engaged by other schools in the local area. Anyone researching the life of Thomas Hopkins would be forgiven for concluding that his career has been rightly relegated to the footnotes of organ building history. But the important thing is that he established a business that then went on to great things. His son, Walter Hopkins, and Edward Hopkins is pretty sure that that is Walter, was born on Sunday, the 21st of February, 1869, and baptized at St. Saviour's on the 29th of March, 1869. Little is known about Walter's early life. Having been brought into the family organ building business at a relatively young age, Walter took over the reins of T. Hopkins and Son when he was still only 24 years old. Walter and his younger brother Harold, listed as an organ builder in the 1891 census, probably started working together before the death of their father in 1893, but few details of the arrangement have been recorded. You can see another photograph of Walter, at least we think it's his. You can see St. Maurice. I'm sure you're all familiar with that one. After marrying Annie Elizabeth Dent on the 9th of August 1893 at St. Maurice, York, the new building, Walter Hopkins, not saying new, it's demolished, but it's newer than the medieval one. Walter Hopkins recommenced work with renewed vigour and energy and attempted to turn around the commercially unsuccessful business that he had inherited. Walter rebuilt the organs of St. Hilda's Ampleforth, St. Andrew's Grinton, and St. Paul's Holgate, but was unable to secure any substantial contracts until the death of his local competitor, John Dorrell Denman, in 1898. You may remember that he died quite young. Business began to improve for Walter Hopkins after moving into the former premises of Denman and Son at 56 Skeldergate. And I must apologise, I have neglected to put in a photograph of 56 Skeldergate. I was talking to Ian about it before. That is the organ building of Lady Anne Middleton's hotel. They make quite a thing about it. They have conferences and things in there. It's still there. Sadly, there's no equipment or anything in there, but it's a good building. So Walter began to dominate the local organ building industry shortly thereafter. He was heralded as an eminent organ expert and presided over T. Hopkins and Son for 28 years until its sale by auction in 1921. Although said to have been a man who enjoyed more than a drink with his friends and was frequently locked in the church on the night before an organ opening in order for him to complete the work when sober, Walter Hopkins still managed to build or rebuild over 50 organs across England during his career. Walter was not as prolific as either Robert Postle or W. Denman and Son, but his instruments are equally worthy of praise and commendation. Now, I'm not going to show you all of them, you'll be pleased to hear, but I thought you might like to see some of the ones that he built or rebuilt. He didn't always build them from scratch in York itself. So he did a rebuild at Sampson's, a new organ at Heworth, which is the first of 3 that building has had. And that's the one he played. A rebuild at St. Mary Castlegate, new organ at St. John's College, and a new organ at All Saints Cathedral, which replaced that earlier bell instrument. That has also been replaced. I'll show you a photograph. St. Margaret's, National Centre for Music, Trinity Methodist on Monkgate, which was, of course, the Trinity Petty Memorial Chapel, St. James, St. Philip and St. James Clifton, St. Barnabas, and so I'll just briefly show you some. This is the replacement, a similar angle to the one we saw of the bell organ. You can see the lovely pulpit of All Saints Cathedral, but now the organ is in an organ chamber. So they actually built, as I'm sure many of you know, a chamber that extended into Coppergate that fitted this Hopkins organ in. One thing you'll notice is that they're all very similar case designs. There isn't really a case, it's what we call a pipe rack. You've got pipes in a rack with a little bit of wood holding them in place. And on that wood, you'll see there's a very familiar, it looks like a Mickey Mouse design, just carved into it. There's pretty much the only detail. But they're wonderful organs. This one has been virtually replaced. There are some pipes from it still in the current instrument, but it's not really the same. 1902, This is St Margaret's Warmgate, contemporary music. Quite an unusual photograph, but that organ sadly has been scrapped years ago. The organ in Trinity Methodist on Monkgate. This is a fantastic instrument. As I'm sure some of you are aware, the Methodist part of this church has ceased having services. The Ark Church is still using it, it's still used for some things, but the fate of the organ is slightly uncertain. And I'd like to make sure it still has a wonderful future. It is a great instrument. St Philip and St James in Clifton, that was when the church, before its famous reordering, that's when the organ was in the chancel. It was rescued after it had been quite badly damaged, actually. Rescued by a farmer who took it with his friends and put it up in his barn. Unfortunately, to get it all in there, they did have to make some alterations, and it's not quite the same, but it still exists. Now, if you want to hear a Hopkins organ in, in original condition, and a good example of their craft, we have a recital every year at St Barnabas in February. We had it 3 weeks ago. And this is one of the best two manuals, two keyboards, instruments that you can find for a long way around. It's a beautiful instrument. Haxby Methodist, the last organ that Hopkins built, 1913, they replaced this, I think in the late 90s or early 2000s, with an electronic instrument. Don't ask me why they did that. Postscript. I am aware that I've gone on for quite a while. I can't finish this off. We've spoken a little bit about the 18th century and before, but mostly focused on the 19th. But we have to just mention what's happened since. So the 20th century is an interesting period for organ building in York. After the sale of Hopkins and Son in 1921, we did have a brief gap until Harold Francis Summers and Albert Henry Barnes opened their factory at St Saviour's Place on Peas Green in York in 1924. They then moved in the 1930s to new premises on Ambrose Street in Fulford. Summers and Barnes built or rebuilt at least 40 organs between 1924 and 1958, including new instruments for Holy Trinity Holtby, St John the Baptist Stamford Bridge, they were sister instruments, and Kirby Miles Yard Methodist Church. Despite the death of Albert Henry Barnes in 1942, Summers and Barnes continued to trade until the retirement of Harold Francis Summers in 1958. One of the things that I remember, little story, just a slight aside, about Francis Jackson, was I had a conversation with him about the organ in St Martin's Coney Street. I'm sure many of you know the previous organ to the one that's in there now took a direct hit in the viaduct arrests and was destroyed. He was telling me that when that was rebuilt in 1939, right before the war, by Summers and Barnes, they were particularly pleased with themselves because they'd copied the style of a very famous firm called Harrison and Harrison of Durham. And the console, he said, looked exactly like a Harrison and Harrison organ. Harrison and Harrison had just been responsible for restoring the York Minster organ at a substantial cost. I wasn't sure whether to take this at face value or whether to believe him until I was in the Borthwick Way and found a photograph of the console, and it does look exactly like a Harrison and Harrison organ. So yeah, Summers and Barnes were not afraid to copy others. After the retirement of Harold Francis Summers in 1958, we had another little gap. But the next significant organ builder to appear in York was Geoffrey Coffin, who established principal pipe organs in October 1983. After building 18 new organs and rebuilding 102 others, including York Minster 1992-3 and Selby Abbey 2015 to 2016, Geoffrey Coffin retired from daily organ building in 2018. I say he retired, he's still doing an awful lot of organ building. Robin Dixon, a former employee of Principal Pipe Organs, now operates a company called York Pipe Organs, and so the tradition of organ building in York remains alive and well today. Thank you very much for listening. Have you got any questions?
I've got one or two observations that it's interesting how so many organ builders cross over into model railways. When I was 30 years ago, I was building a layout for exhibition, which was mounted at eye level. And my next door neighbour was Neil Hooper, who was an employee of Principal Pipe Organs. And I was saying, how can I control the centre of gravity? Ah, he said, you need bellows weights. So he knocked on my door with 2 huge lumps of cast iron from an organ they must have been working on. So I'm wondering if an organ somewhere has lost its bellows weights, but I've got them, 2 of them, big lumps of cast iron, just like pig iron. And they're done to govern the bellows.
It keeps the air under pressure,
Yeah.
so that when you press a key, you've got a constant pressure.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it would be variable.
So when did the sort of electric action start to come?
Well, we've had experiments with, basically you can have a mechanical action instrument, which a lot of them still are. And Dennis has just had an organ from the 19th century by Willis installed, and of course St Lawrence. That's all mostly mechanical, not all, mostly mechanical. But there were experiments with different types of action using pneumatics, little puffs of air, and then electrics from the end of the 19th century onwards. There's not been a complete changeover. We still build mechanical action instruments today.
Yeah.
That's a
Because
nice mix.
it was strange with the Denman organ that we saw at St Lawrence's that Nick Bealby, being an engineer, was on hand to say the accuracy of the foundation on which to build the organ. That the former chapel at St Lawrence's had to be level with cement to within 2 millimeters of accuracy of the flatness of the floor. And Nick, being Nick, found a builder who could do that and had a perfect floor. The rebuild was £400,000. So compared to the original price of the organ at St Michael of Belfry, it's quite extensive.
But a lovely tribute to a late YAYA member called Geoffrey Donald, who sadly is no longer with us, but left quite a substantial sum towards that.
Yeah.
And he was a huge enthusiast for the organ builders of York. He never saw my PhD finish, sadly, but he would be delighted with what's happened.
Yeah, there is a photo in the Handstock collection looking from the top of the building in Parliament Street at All Saints pavement. You can physically see the organ chamber added to the side. I'm not quite old enough to remember it being there, but it was taken down in the 60s to widen Coppergate. But actually, it went right into Coppergate and reduced its width even more at that point. I think it's 2-way traffic through there now. And to build an actual chapel for an organ is quite an astonishing undertaking. Any other questions?
Yeah.
There's 2, there are 2 on the chat. So I noticed 2 messages. All right. Okay.
Okay.
Well, I think that's a very comprehensive introduction to York organ builders. So I'll never look at John Ward Knowles in glass without thinking of Denman and organ at the same time. These 2 great behemoths of building in York. So no more questions on the chat. So just to thank Max very much for a very interesting talk. I look forward to hearing more in the future.
Okay.